Hello and welcome to Active Listening. I'm your host, Tracy Mergen, and this training is designed for group participation. So we want to make sure we have 2 or more participants in the training. So here's today's agenda. We'll start off with an introduction of everybody in the room. We'll then talk about communication in general, a major myth and barriers in communication. Then we'll talk about how to deploy active listening. We'll have a group exercise, and then we'll draw conclusions. Finally, we'll have a short, very short quiz at the end. During this training, I'll need somebody to man the mouse because there will be video pauses for discussion or exercises. Thanks. So let's move on to introduction, shall we? So please take a few moments to share your name, your job title, and a brief description of what effective communication means to you. So here's where you pause now for discussion. Welcome back. So effective communication is a desirable skill in all employees, right? We think of effective communication as a person who is skilled in oral and written skills when dealing with customers or employees. This is the person we often think of who is the speaker or the sender of the message. But this training is designed to help you become aware that effective communication is also about listening. It's not just the speaker who communicates. This is where the major myth comes in. Because back in the day, in the 1990s, there was this study done on the perceptions of effective listeners, a management study, as you see here in the Journal of Business Communication. So these managers, they were given a self-assessment survey of how well they thought they were good listeners, right? Effective listeners. And so these managers, they rated themselves. None of them rated themselves as poor or very poor. And then they gave the survey to their subordinates. Yeah, so the subordinates rated their managers very poor in listening, and it became this aha moment of, oh, wait a minute, I think I'm a good listener, but I'm actually not. Then we come to actual barriers of communication. We have environmental, physiological, and psychological barriers. All day long, everywhere you look. So think about an environmental barrier. This could be something in your office, in the environment, that is a barrier for communication. I think of a large open floor cubicle area with lots of people, and it's hard to concentrate. It's hard to listen. It's hard to do anything because there's so many distractions of people talking, someone listening to music in their cubicle, people walking by. That's an environmental barrier for communication. Then there's physiological. This is actually to do with your physical being. So let's say you have a head cold and you're really feeling like terrible, and your boss is talking to you and you can't even breathe, and you're really not concentrating and you can't listen. You're failing in your communication because you have a physiological barrier. Then there's the psychological barrier. This is the type of barrier where you're distracted, you're overwhelmed. Let's say you've been in a meeting and you've been assigned 4 or 5 different projects and you're just on overload at this point. It's hard to communicate for you. It's even hard for you to listen because you're just overwhelmed with stress. This can also be said of people who are just overwhelmed with something that might be going on in their personal life at home. It's like a psychological distraction. This becomes a barrier for communication. So at this point, let's take a moment in the room to discuss your work center and the barriers that you can identify on a daily basis. Let's go ahead and pause the video, and each of you come up with, say, maybe 2 for environment, 2 for physiological, and 2 for psychological, so you can discuss. Go ahead, pause for discussion. Welcome back. So now that we've talked about those barriers, and there's a lot of them, right? You look around your work center, you can pinpoint all kinds of barriers for good communication. How about figuring out ways to eliminate these barriers, if possible? A good example is if someone were to walk into my office, one of the things I would want to do is turn my radio down, because I usually have a radio playing. That radio is going to become a barrier for me to be able to listen, so I'm going to turn it down. If I'm working on a computer project, something that's actively moving around on my screen, I can also lock my computer and make sure that doesn't distract me, again, so I can actively listen. Body language is important here too, because when someone comes into my office, not only do I want to go ahead and shut down the distractions, but I also want to point my face and my body towards the person who's talking to me. This may seem like a small gesture, but body language is a huge part of human communication, right? So you want to make sure you're showing the person that I'm listening because I'm looking at you and my body is pointed toward you. Another way to deploy your skill of actively listening is paraphrasing back to the speaker. What this means is just kind of reiterating what they just said to you. This has 2 really great purposes. First of all, you let them know you're listening because you're repeating back to them what they said, right? But you also have an opportunity to clarify anything that might have been passed between you that was a misunderstanding. So if I repeat what you said to me, then you know I heard you, and I make sure I heard you correctly. The last thing about actively listening is asking substantive questions, meaning if I just kind of go, yeah, yeah, then it's kind of hard for the person to know if I'm actually really listening. But what if I say, I really like where you're going with this. Have you thought about considering XYZ as an alternative solution? Then not only am I listening and reiterating back what I heard, but I'm also making suggestions and engaging in this conversation. So we really, really know for sure that there's good communication happening between the 2 of us. Those are 4 main parts of actively listening. And these are important skills that we're here to train about today. Eliminate barriers. Remember your body language. Paraphrase back to the speaker and ask substantive questions. So now we're going to break out into a group exercise, and we're going to do this with each other, right? So try to break out into pairs. And each of you take turns being the speaker and then the other person being the listener and so on. About 5 minutes to the speaker will talk about how long you've been with the organization, what kind of work you do, and then talk about hobbies you enjoy when you're not at work. Okay, so that's the speaker's role. And then the listener's role is to actively listen, deploy all the things that we've talked about. But at some point, I want to shake things up and I want you to get out your cell phone and look at it. Check your text, look at what time it is, and look at your cell phone for about 15 to 25 seconds while the speaker is still talking. If you don't have your cell phone, you just take out a piece of paper and write something on it or whatever. The point is to show what it looks like when you're not actively listening, of course. So let's go ahead and pause for group exercise. Welcome back. So now is your chance to present to the group the information you learned about your partner. Okay, so take turns right now in telling who you worked with, about how long they've been with the organization, what they do and the hobbies that they like. And we'll discuss our conclusion in the next slide. So here's, again, let's pause for group discussion. Okay. So now that you've had the opportunity to reflect on the group exercise and see what active and not active listening looks like, let's ask the speaker, what kind of body language did you notice? Were there any questions asked? How did you feel when the listener checked the phone? It probably made you feel kind of like you weren't being listened to, right? And to the listener, did you hear everything? Did you miss any information? Did your mind begin to drift? Because that happens. You think you're actively listening and someone's telling you something, and before you know it, you're thinking about a story that you're going to tell that person when they're done speaking. So that's not active listening. That's getting ready to tell your side of the story. So if you could pause one last time for this group exercise to share your experience on how this exercise helped you understand the role of speaker and listener, this would be helpful to share your knowledge. Please pause. Welcome back. Guess what? A quick quiz. Really, it's just these 6 questions. So go ahead and pause the video and leave this on screen so you can just read through and answer 1 through 6, true or false. You don't have to write them down, just be thinking about what your answer would be. Go ahead and pause for the quick quiz. So here are the answers. How'd you do? Number 1, your neighbor's radio playing softly is a communication barrier. That is true. Number 2, all managers are highly skilled at effective communication. Of course, we know that's false. Number 3, an example of physiological barrier is worried about your dog throwing up this morning. That is false, only because it's not a physiological barrier, it's a psychological barrier. Number 4, not interrupting but thinking about a story you want to tell when the speaker is done talking is good active listening skills. Well, that's false. Not interrupting is good manners, of course, but if you're thinking about something else while someone is talking, then that is not good active listening skills. Number 5, looking at the speaker face to face is good body language for active listening. This is true. Of course, you want your face and your body pointed towards the person who's talking to you. And number 6, if you paraphrase what the speaker just said to you, you are wasting valuable time communicating. This is, of course, false, because we know that when you paraphrase what the speaker just said to you, you let the speaker know you heard them, and that you made sure you had clarity of the message. So our conclusions for active listening are this. Do not assume you are a good listener. This is hard because, if you're already in the mindset that you're a good listener, you're already encountering a psychological barrier to good communication, aren't you? So know what your communication barriers are and avoid them. And of course, the skill of listening with your body and your mind is very, very important with active listening. And that concludes the training. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I hope you learned something, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.